along the quiet shores and deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the rivers keep their secrets and the mountains stand guard in the dark. This is the High Strangeness Sleep Society, a place for sleepless minds, late-night wanderers, and those of us who have always suspected the world is just a little stranger than it pretends to be. Tonight we leave the rain-soaked cedar and salt air behind and travel east to the hills of West Virginia, where the Ohio River moves slow and black beneath old bridges, and where the highways cut through the mountains like long ribbons of silence. It is a landscape made for stories. Coal towns, river fog, old diners still glowing past midnight, and roads that feel far lonelier after dark than they ever do in daylight. If you have ever driven alone at night through country like that, you know the feeling. The radio low, the windshield full of rain, the sense that the world beyond your headlights might be holding its breath. In the autumn of 1966, before Point Pleasant became forever linked to wings and red eyes, and before the word Mothman entered American folklore, another story was already unfolding just up the road near Parkersburg. It did not begin with a creature in the woods or strange lights over the river. It began with a man trying to get home. His name was Woodrow Derenberger, and by every reasonable measure he was ordinary, which is often how these stories begin. He was a husband, a father, and a traveling salesman, a man whose days were shaped by miles of highway, paper cups of coffee, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing the porch light on when he finally pulled into the driveway. He was not a professional mystic. He was not writing letters to flying saucer clubs. He was not standing in open fields waiting for visitors from the stars. He was working, driving, paying bills, and doing what most people do, which is trying to make it through the week with as little trouble as possible. That is part of what made people listen when he told his story. He did not sound like a man searching for attention. If anything, he sounded like someone who would have preferred the entire thing had never happened. It was the evening of November 2nd, 1966. He was driving south on Interstate 77 near the Route 47 interchange, heading home through rain and darkness. The road was slick, the kind of wet pavement that turns every headlight into a reflection and every mile into two. The hills around him were black against a darker sky, and traffic had thinned to almost nothing. Just the steady sweep of the wipers, the hum of the engine, and that familiar late-night highway trance where your hands know the road better than your thoughts do. And then beside him, something appeared. At first he thought it was another vehicle pacing his truck, but almost immediately he understood that whatever had pulled alongside him was not moving like any ordinary car. He would later describe it as dark and charcoal gray, shaped like the glass chimney of an old kerosene lamp, low and solid, with a smoothness that felt wrong somehow, as though it had been built without the same logic the rest of our machines obey. It hovered just above the road and matched his speed with impossible ease, holding position beside him like it had been there all along. Then it turned, slowly and deliberately, and settled across both lanes of the interstate, blocking the road from berm to berm. He brought the truck to a stop. Now, if you are listening to this late at night, safe at home with the lights low, it is easy to imagine what you would do. You would turn around, you would reverse, you would decide very quickly that whatever was happening ahead of you was not your business. But fear and curiosity have always been close cousins, and sometimes the need to understand is stronger than the instinct to run. A door opened, and what stepped out was not a monster. That may be the strangest part of the whole story. No silver suit, no bug-eyed visitor from a drive-in movie, no glowing being from another dimension, just a man About 6 feet tall, dark hair combed straight back, a deep tan, as though he had spent his life beneath a stronger sun than West Virginia had ever offered. He wore dark blue clothing with a faint shine to it, almost formal but impossible to place, and he stood there with his arms folded beneath his chest, like a patient man waiting for someone to finish asking the obvious question. And he was smiling. Not a warm smile, not a friendly smile, a fixed smile, calm, steady, the kind of smile that somehow makes a quiet room feel much quieter. Derenberger would later say the fear truly arrived when he realized the man's lips were not moving. The voice came anyway, not through the air but directly into his mind. Calm, clear, almost polite. Do not be frightened. We wish you no harm. Imagine that for a moment. A silent highway, rain ticking softly against the truck, a stranger standing in the headlights, smiling, and a voice arriving inside your own thoughts like it had always been there. The questions he asked were strangely ordinary. What were the lights in the distance? What was the name of that city? What kind of work did he do? There was something deeply unsettling about how normal the conversation sounded. It was as if someone had studied human beings from a distance and learned the structure of small talk without ever understanding why we bothered with it. Derenberger answered. Those were the lights of Parkersburg, he explained. He told him he was a salesman. The stranger listened, smiling the entire time as though this information mattered. He told Derenberger that they were the same as us. He said he was what he called a searcher. And when Derenberger asked where he came from, the answer was not a planet, not at first. He described it only as a gathering, a strange word, close enough to make sense and wrong enough to stay with you afterward. A gathering of what? A place, a people, a destination. Even now, it feels like the kind of answer that explains nothing and somehow says everything. Then, before stepping back into the dark machine waiting silently across the road, he gave Derenberger one final sentence. Mr. Derenberger, we will see you again. And that, listeners, is where the real story begins. Because he did return. Or at least, Derenberger would spend the rest of his life insisting that he did. The smiling man would come back again and again, and with every new encounter the story would drift farther from the wet pavement of Interstate 77 and deeper into territory where journalism starts to fail and mythology takes over. Soon the man called only Cold would become Indrid Cold. Soon there would be a wife named Kimi, children, a navigator named Carl Ardo, and a home world called Lanulos, a place with 3 seasons, no war, no hatred, and lives that stretched far longer than our own. Somewhere between that first lonely roadside meeting and the impossible geography of Lanulos, the story stopped being a UFO encounter and became something older in shape, a visitation story, a contact myth, a modern American fairy tale told in the language of highways, television stations, and late-night phone calls. And like all stories that survive this long, the real mystery may not be whether it happened. The real mystery may be why we still want it to. Before Lanulos had a name, before Indrid Cold became a permanent resident of paranormal folklore, before John Keel folded the story into the wider storm of Mothman, Men in Black, and ultra-terrestrials, there was simply Woodrow Derenberger trying to explain to people what had happened to him on a wet stretch of highway outside Parkersburg. And that may be the most important part of the story, because strange stories survive or die based on the person telling them. If the witness feels dishonest, the mystery collapses. If the witness feels too polished, too eager, too dramatic, people lean back. But if the witness sounds like someone you know, someone who seems almost uncomfortable speaking at all, the story lingers. It settles in. It becomes harder to dismiss. That was part of Derenberger's strange credibility. He was around 50 years old in the fall of 1966, a salesman from the Parkersburg area, married, with children, living the kind of life that rarely ends up in books about the unexplained. His work meant long drives and longer days. He sold sewing machines and home products, traveling the roads between small towns, knocking on doors, talking to strangers, and doing the ordinary labor of making a living in mid-century America. It was not glamorous, but it was familiar. It gave his life a dependable rhythm. Drive, work, come home, repeat. There is something important in that rhythm because people like routine. We trust it. A man who spends his life following roads and schedules does not easily become the center of something impossible. He is not supposed to. Parkersburg itself was built on that same kind of practical certainty. It was a river town, an industrial place where the Ohio moved steadily past bridges and factories and neighborhoods built around shift work and church schedules. It was a place where people knew their neighbors, where local news mattered, and where stories traveled fast because there were not that many places for them to go. This was not New York. It was not Los Angeles. There were no bright city distractions here, no endless noise to swallow a strange report whole. If something unusual happened, people talked about it. They talked about it at the gas station, at church, over coffee at the diner, and on front porches after dark. Especially if the person telling the story was someone they already knew. That is another reason the case spread so quickly. Derenberger was not a stranger to the community. He was local. He had a family. He had responsibilities. He was not introducing himself through the mystery. People already knew who he was before the mystery arrived. And yet, after that night on Interstate 77, his ordinary life began to bend around one extraordinary event. He did something that still surprises people looking back at the case. He reported it almost immediately. He did not hide it for years. He did not wait until the details became polished. He told people, fast. Within a day, the story had reached local authorities, reporters, and television. He appeared on WTAP in Parkersburg and described the encounter publicly, knowing full well how it would sound. Police were involved. Air Force representatives took interest. Reporters asked the same question in different forms. Are you sure? And every time he gave essentially the same answer. Yes. That consistency matters, even if it does not prove anything. People often assume belief depends on evidence alone, but it rarely works that way. It depends on confidence, on tone, on whether the witness seems to be remembering or performing. Derenberger, at least in those earliest interviews, sounded like a man trying to remember. Not a prophet, not a showman. A man trying to explain why his drive home had stopped making sense. There were supportive voices, too. Some locals believed him. Some said they had seen strange things near the highway that week. One witness later claimed to have seen a figure standing beside a stopped vehicle around the same time. Newspapers began carrying the story farther than Parkersburg. Curiosity seekers arrived. Suddenly, his farm and his family were part of something public. And that is where these stories often become dangerous. Because once the world decides you are the man who saw something impossible, you no longer get to return to being ordinary. Every question becomes about the event. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every contradiction becomes evidence. People want more. They always want more. They do not want a strange encounter. They want answers. Where did the man come from? Why you? Why now? Was it God, aliens, government, madness, prophecy? An ordinary witness quickly discovers that people are not satisfied with uncertainty. They want shape, they want meaning, they want the mystery to point somewhere, and sometimes, perhaps without meaning to, the witness begins giving them one. This is where the story starts to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to notice. The smiling man was no longer simply a stranger on the road. He had a name now, or at least more of one. Cold. Soon, Indrid Cold. The place he came from was no longer just a gathering. It would become something far more specific. A world. Lanulos. And once a mystery has a proper noun, once it has names and places and details that can be repeated, it becomes much harder to contain. Stories grow faster when people can point to them. This was no longer just a frightening encounter on a rainy highway, it was becoming a map. And maps invite travelers. The press wanted more, researchers wanted more, believers wanted more, skeptics wanted contradictions. And standing in the middle of all of it was a salesman from West Virginia who had started with one strange night and was now being asked to explain an entire universe. That is a heavy thing to place on an ordinary man, maybe too heavy. Because 2 days after the first encounter, according to Derenberger, the smiling man returned. And this time he did not just ask questions. This time he told him where he came from. The first encounter on Interstate 77 was strange enough to stand on its own. A dark object hovering over the road, a smiling man with unmoving lips, a voice arriving inside the mind instead of through the air. For most people, that would have been the entire story, a single impossible memory carried for the rest of a life. But according to Woodrow Derenberger, it did not end there. The man he had met on the highway returned, not with flashing lights or another roadside confrontation, but in a way that made the whole thing somehow more unsettling. The second contact did not happen with a crowd watching or police taking notes. It happened quietly while Derenberger was driving again, as though whatever had found him on that first night had simply decided the conversation was not finished. This is the point where the story begins to leave the solid ground of witness testimony and step into stranger country. It is also the point where listeners tend to divide. Some stay with him, others step away, because once the second contact begins, we are no longer talking about a close encounter. We are talking about a relationship. In later retellings, Derenberger said that while driving with a friend named Philip Elliott, he became aware that the object was above them again, moving overhead, unseen but somehow understood. The communication returned the same way it had before, directly into his thoughts, calm and certain, without sound. He was told not to be afraid. He was told to drive carefully. And then, for the first time, the smiling man began to explain himself. His name, he said, was not simply Cold. It was Indrid Cold, and where he came from was called Lanulos. Now, names matter in stories like this. A nameless visitor can remain a mystery forever, but once something has a name, the human mind begins building rooms around it. A name creates shape. It creates memory. It creates the possibility that this thing, whatever it is, belongs somewhere. Lanulos was not described as a distant star in the way science fiction usually imagines. Derenberger would later place it near what he called the galaxy of Ganymede, a phrase that made astronomers wince and believers lean closer. It was not technically correct, but high strangeness rarely is. It sounded like someone translating something too large into the nearest available language and getting the edges wrong. Lanulos, according to Derenberger, was a place of peace. There was no hatred there, no war, no violence in the ordinary human sense. Its people lived far longer than we do, somewhere between 125 and 175 Earth years, depending on which version of the story you read. They experienced 3 seasons instead of 4. Their lives moved differently. Their priorities were different. They had advanced beyond the things that seemed to keep humanity trapped in repetition. For a man living in Cold War America, that description carried its own kind of gravity. Remember the year, 1966, Vietnam on the evening news. Nuclear fear sitting quietly in the background of daily life. Political unrest growing louder. The idea of another world without hatred, without war, without the machinery of human conflict, did not just sound strange, it sounded desirable. That is one reason contactee stories from this era often sound less like invasion stories and more like moral lessons. The visitors are not conquerors, they are mirrors. They arrive not to destroy us, but to quietly suggest that we are living badly. Indrid Cold fit that pattern perfectly. He was not threatening. He was calm, friendly even. He did not arrive with warnings of doom or demands for obedience. He asked questions. He observed. He behaved less like a conqueror than a traveler mildly surprised by the way Earth had organized itself. Derenberger said Cold explained that he was what he called a searcher, someone whose purpose involved movement, observation, and contact. He referred to Earth almost like a neighboring place, familiar but unfinished. There was no grand speech, no declaration of cosmic truth, just the slow unfolding of a world that sounded almost close enough to touch. Soon there were more details. Cold had a wife. Her name was Kimi. He had children. There were others like him, among them a navigator named Karl Ardo, who would become part of the growing mythology surrounding Lanulos. The world itself developed structure. It had systems of leadership, social order, and spiritual ideas that sounded both alien and strangely idealized. The details multiplied, and with every new addition, the story moved farther from the original roadside encounter and deeper into the territory of classic contactee literature. This is where skepticism naturally enters the room, because there is a visible difference between a man describing a strange event and a man describing an entire civilization. One feels like testimony, the other feels like cosmology. And yet Derenberger kept telling it. That is the part people often underestimate. It is easy to dismiss one strange interview. It is harder to explain a person who continues, year after year, to live inside the story they started. Fame from this kind of thing is rarely glamorous. It is expensive. It costs privacy. It costs credibility. It turns ordinary errands into conversations you do not want to have. And still, he stayed with it. He wrote, he gave interviews. He described Lanulos not like fiction, but like memory. Maybe he believed every word. Maybe the story had grown large enough that belief no longer mattered. Because once people begin treating your experience like mythology, even you may stop knowing where the first truth ended. And there is another reason this part of the story matters, because Lanulos was not just a destination, it was a promise. A place where human problems had already been solved. A world where fear, hatred, and violence had been left behind. A place better than here. Every era creates its own version of paradise. Sometimes it is heaven, sometimes it is Atlantis, sometimes it is Shangri-La hidden in the mountains. And in 1966, on a dark highway in West Virginia, paradise arrived wearing a blue coat and a fixed smile. Its name was Lanulos. And according to Woodrow Derenberger, he was not just invited to learn about it, he was invited to visit. Once Lanulos had a name, the story changed shape. A strange encounter on a highway can remain local. It can live in the newspaper for a few days, travel through a few conversations at the diner, and eventually settle into that uncertain category of things people half remember and half doubt. But a named world is different. A named world invites questions. People want to know what it looks like, who lives there, how they live, and perhaps most importantly, whether it might somehow be better than here. And according to Woodrow Derenberger, it was. Lanulos was not described as a harsh alien landscape or some metallic science fiction empire of cold machines and perfect geometry. It sounded in many ways almost domestic, peaceful, ordered, familiar in the way dreams are familiar, where everything makes emotional sense even if the details refuse to stay still. There were seasons there, though not ours. Derenberger spoke of 3 seasons instead of 4, a small detail that somehow made the place feel more believable than grand declarations ever could. Small details are persuasive. They feel accidental. A liar invents drama. A believer remembers weather. Its people lived longer than we do, sometimes far longer, with lifespans stretching well beyond a century. Age was not treated the same way. Time itself seemed softer there, less urgent. There was no sense of the hurried human panic that drives so much of life on Earth, that constant race between work, money, illness, and the quiet knowledge that the clock is always moving. Most striking of all, there was no hatred, no war, no violence in the way we understand it. Now, if that sounds less like an alien report and more like a Sunday sermon, you are not wrong. This is where the Lanulos story begins to resemble something older than ufology. It starts to feel like the old human habit of placing perfection somewhere far away. Another island, another kingdom, another world where the mistakes we keep repeating have already been solved by someone wiser. That is not necessarily evidence of deception. It may be evidence of longing. Because paradise stories rarely tell us where heaven is. They tell us what we wish Earth could be. Indrid Cold, for all his strangeness, was never presented as a conqueror or a prophet of doom. He was not here to warn humanity about invasion fleets or apocalyptic judgment. He was calm, almost gentle, and his presence carried the strange confidence of someone visiting a place he did not fear. He behaved less like an alien and more like a traveler who found us interesting. He also, according to Derenberger, had a family. This detail pushes the story into even stranger territory, because it removes the distance people often place between themselves and the other. It is easy to imagine a mysterious visitor as a symbol, harder to imagine him going home to dinner. Cold had a wife. Her name was Kimmy. He had children. There were routines, relationships, and domestic structures that made Lanulos feel less like a distant cosmic abstraction and more like a place where people simply lived. That intimacy is one reason the story remains so compelling. Monsters are easier to dismiss. Family is harder. Family makes the impossible feel personal. There were others too. One of the most repeated names was Carl Ardo, described as a navigator and associate of Cold, another visitor tied to the same world. Over time, more names entered the mythology, each one making Lanulos feel less like a metaphor and more like a place with its own society, its own cast of characters, its own political and spiritual architecture. Derenberger would describe forms of leadership there, systems of guidance and order, even a kind of governing council. Religion existed, though not in the way most Earth religions framed it. The descriptions shifted depending on the telling, but the consistent theme was harmony, less hierarchy, less conflict, more understanding. Lanulos was not simply advanced in technology, it was morally advanced. And that may be the most suspicious detail of all, because the moment another civilization sounds exactly like our own fantasies of perfection, skepticism naturally sharpens. This is one reason many researchers place the Derenberger story firmly within the tradition of the American contactee movement, a strange little chapter of post-war paranormal history where ordinary people claimed repeated contact with visitors from worlds that often sounded suspiciously like spiritual self-help seminars in space. In the 1950s and 60s, men like George Adamski and others told stories of beautiful, peaceful beings from Venus or beyond who arrived not to invade but to teach. Their messages were often moral. Stop fighting, stop destroying the planet, grow spiritually, become better. Lanulos fits that shape almost perfectly. That does not automatically make it false. It simply places it inside a recognizable pattern. And patterns matter, because once a story enters a pattern, it becomes harder to tell whether the witness is reporting experience or unconsciously borrowing structure from the stories already circulating around them. Sometimes belief works like architecture. We do not invent from nothing. We build using shapes we already know. Maybe Derenberger met something truly strange and spent years trying to explain it using the only language available to him. Or maybe Lanulos was built the way all mythic places are built, one detail at a time, using desire, fear, and the cultural furniture already sitting in the room. Either way, the place became real enough to survive. People still talk about Lanulos today not because they can prove it exists, but because it feels like it should exist. It satisfies a very old hunger. Somewhere out there, the story says, there is a place where people learned how to stop ruining everything. That is a powerful idea, especially in a century built on war, especially in a country watching violence on the evening news every night. Especially for an ordinary salesman driving home through rain, being told by a smiling stranger that another way of living was not only possible, but already real. And according to Derenberger, Lanulos was not just a place he heard about. It was a place he would eventually see for himself, which is where the story takes its boldest step. Because hearing about paradise is one thing, claiming you have been there is another entirely. There is a quiet line in stories like this, a point where even the most patient listener has to decide how far they are willing to follow. Seeing a strange object on a dark road is one thing. Meeting a smiling man who speaks without moving his lips is another. Even that, strange as it sounds, can still live in the category of unexplained experience, filed somewhere between fear and possibility. But eventually, the question changes. Did he really go there? That is where the Lanulos story asks the most of us. Because according to Woodrow Derenberger, the smiling man did not remain a visitor at the edge of his life. Indrid Cold became a recurring presence. The encounters continued, conversations deepened. The distance between Earth and Lanulos, whatever that distance truly meant, began to feel less like astronomy and more like an open door. There were visits. Sometimes, Derenberger said, Cold would appear near his home, not in grand cinematic arrivals, but in the ordinary spaces where strange things become hardest to explain. A backyard, a quiet road, a place near the house where neighbors might have passed without noticing anything unusual at all. That detail matters because it shifts the story from spectacle to intimacy. The extraordinary was no longer interrupting life, it was moving into it. Imagine trying to explain that to your family. Not just that you saw something once, but that it keeps coming back. That there is a man from somewhere beyond language standing near your yard, asking calm questions about your world. That he smiles like he already knows how the conversation ends. These are the kinds of details that make witnesses either saints or liars in the public imagination. There is rarely room for anything in between. And still, Derenberger kept talking. He described repeated contact, long conversations, more details about Lanulos, more names, more certainty. At times, the story took on the structure of correspondence, as though Earth and somewhere else had established a strange and deeply personal diplomatic relationship through one very ordinary man in West Virginia. Then came the biggest claim of all. He said he had gone there. Accounts vary depending on which source you read, and like many stories that grow over years, the exact details shift at the edges. But the central claim remained the same. Derenberger was not merely told about Lanulos. He was taken there, transported, brought to another world. Now, from a purely skeptical point of view, this is the moment many people close the book. A roadside encounter may feel possible. A trip to another planet pushes the story into territory most listeners instinctively reject. And yet, strangely, this is often where belief becomes strongest for the people inside the story. Because once a witness crosses that line publicly, there is no easy return. You are no longer protecting your credibility, you are sacrificing it. That sacrifice creates its own strange kind of conviction. What would Lanulos have looked like? Descriptions differ, but the emotional texture remains consistent. Peace, order, calm, a world without the frantic noise of human conflict. It was not described like a futuristic empire of chrome towers and glowing machines. It felt quieter than that, softer, less interested in technology as spectacle and more interested in civilization as harmony. That may be why the story never feels fully like science fiction. It feels like longing. Lanulos was not impressive because it was advanced. It was impressive because it was better. No hatred, no war, longer lives, greater understanding, a place where the mistakes of Earth had already been left behind. It is difficult not to notice how perfectly this mirrors human fantasy. Every age invents its unreachable country. Medieval Europe had Avalon. Explorers chased El Dorado. Mystics looked for Shambhala. And in post-war America, with rockets rising and nuclear fear hanging over dinner tables, paradise arrived as a neighboring civilization in the stars, or perhaps beside them, if John Keel was right. But before Keel enters the story, Derenberger had become something else entirely. He was no longer simply a witness, he was a contactee. That word carries a very specific history in American paranormal culture. A witness sees something. A contactee is chosen. They become a bridge between worlds, willingly or not, and their lives are reshaped by that role. People write to them, researchers call, skeptics circle, believers project meaning onto every sentence they speak. And fame, even strange fame, has gravity. Reporters came. Curious strangers arrived. People wanted stories, details, proof. His home became part of the legend. The ordinary privacy of family life gave way to the constant pressure of being the man who knew where Lanulos was. There is something tragic in that, because no matter what you believe about the truth of his claims, it is clear that Derenberger could never fully go back to being anonymous. Once the world decides your name belongs to a mystery, it keeps asking you to feed it. And stories, like people, adapt to attention. They grow, they harden, they become difficult to separate from the person telling them. By the late 1960s, Derenberger's account had moved far beyond the first wet stretch of highway. There were books, articles, late-night radio appearances. The smiling man from the roadside had become Indrid Cold, one of the strangest recurring figures in American Fortean history. And yet, the deeper the story went, the more another figure became impossible to ignore. Because somewhere in the Ohio Valley, another writer was collecting reports of red-eyed creatures strange lights, black cars, and visitors who asked too many questions. He looked at Derenberger's smiling man and saw not just a UFO story, but part of a much larger pattern. His name was John Keel, and he believed Indrid Cold might not be an alien at all. By the time John Keel entered the story, the Ohio Valley already felt like a place where reality had become unreliable. Reports were arriving from everywhere. Strange lights over back roads, winged figures near the old TNT area outside Point Pleasant, telephone disturbances, animals behaving strangely, men in dark suits asking questions no one had invited them to ask. The atmosphere itself seemed to thicken, as though once one impossible thing was allowed into the room, others found the door easier to open. Most people looking at these reports tried to separate them. A UFO over here, a monster over there, a nervous town turning rumor into folklore somewhere in between. Keel did the opposite. He believed they were connected. That instinct is one reason his name still hangs over every serious conversation about Point Pleasant. He was not interested in collecting strange stories like stamps. He wanted a theory large enough to hold all of them at once. And Woodrow Derenberger's smiling visitor fit perfectly. Keel was already known for chasing UFO reports and strange encounters across the country, but West Virginia became something different for him. It was not just another investigation. It felt like a concentration point, a place where the usual rules had weakened. The first Mothman reports had begun near Point Pleasant in November of 1966, only days after Derenberger's roadside encounter. Two young couples described a large winged creature with glowing red eyes near the abandoned TNT plant, and local reporter Mary Heyer began documenting the flood of strange reports that followed. That flood mattered, because once the newspapers start printing the strange starts multiplying. People came looking for monsters. Sometimes they found them. Sometimes they found only the idea of them. And somewhere inside that growing storm of fear and fascination, Keel saw a pattern. He did not believe these were simple extraterrestrials arriving in nuts and bolts spacecraft from another planet. In fact, he thought the alien explanation was often too simple, too clean, too comforting. Aliens at least obey a familiar logic. They come from somewhere, they travel here, they leave. Keel suspected something worse. He proposed the idea of what he called ultra-terrestrials. Not visitors from another planet, but intelligences that had always existed alongside us, operating just outside ordinary perception, stepping in and out of our reality when it suited them. Not extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional perhaps, or older than that. Something native to the edges of human experience. In Keel's view, these beings were not presenting themselves honestly. They were adapting, changing shape, wearing whatever mask the moment required. In another century, they might have been called fairies, demons, angels, spirits in the woods. In modern America, they arrived as UFO occupants, men in black, smiling strangers by the roadside, and winged things standing under abandoned floodlights. Different costumes, same performance. This is where Indrid Cold becomes far more interesting than a simple alien visitor, because if Keel was right, Cold was not a man from Lanulos. He was theater, a role being played, a face chosen because it would be just believable enough to stay with you. Think about that fixed smile. Think about the oddly formal clothing, the strange but polite conversation, the almost human quality of it all. Not monstrous, worse than monstrous, familiar but not quite correct, like something had studied humanity from a distance and built a convincing imitation with one or two details left slightly wrong. That is often how old folklore describes trickster entities. They are not terrifying because they look inhuman. They are terrifying because they look almost human, close enough to let you stand there talking to them. Keel believed the Men in Black stories belonged to the same category: strange visitors arriving after sightings, dark cars, awkward conversations, questions that felt rehearsed, people who looked human but seemed to misunderstand ordinary behavior in small, unsettling ways. Too formal, too stiff, too interested in details that should not matter. Again, not monsters, masks. And if that idea sounds absurd, it is worth remembering how often folklore repeats itself under new names. Medieval Europe told stories of travelers meeting strange figures on roads at night, beings who asked questions, offered warnings, or left people changed forever. Appalachian folklore is full of stories about things in the woods that should not be followed and visitors who should not be invited inside. Technology changes, the shape of fear does not. This is why Keel matters so much to the Indrid Cold story. Without him, Derenberger might have remained a regional UFO witness, a local mystery with a strange newspaper archive. Keel placed him inside a much larger mythological machine. He made Cold part of the same weather system as Mothman, the Men in Black, and the growing sense that Point Pleasant was not being visited by aliens, but haunted by intelligence itself. That interpretation is powerful because it solves one problem while creating 10 more. It explains why the stories contradict each other. It explains why the visitors behave like symbols instead of explorers. It explains why the details feel dreamlike, inconsistent, emotionally true, but scientifically slippery. But it also asks the listener to accept something far stranger than aliens. Not travelers from another planets, neighbors, things that have always been here, watching, adapting, waiting for us to notice. For Keel, the real mystery was never whether a ship landed on a highway. It was why these encounters always seemed designed to destabilize the witness rather than inform them. The purpose did not appear to be contact. It appeared to be confusion. The event itself mattered less than the ripple it created afterward. Fear, obsession, belief, stories spreading through a town like weather. Maybe that was the point. And if so, then Lanulos itself might not be a destination at all. It might be bait, a perfect world offered to a witness because it would hold his attention, because paradise is easier to follow than terror, because a smiling messenger is more persuasive than a monster with red eyes. That possibility makes the story darker, because it means the visitor on Interstate 77 was never introducing himself. He was designing an experience, and if that sounds like paranoia, it should, because eventually every story like this reaches the same uncomfortable place. You stop asking what happened and start asking whether the mystery wanted to happen. But even the most elegant theory meets resistance, and eventually every mythology runs into the same problem: evidence. Every good mystery eventually reaches the same uncomfortable room, the room with fluorescent lights, the room where someone asks for dates, documents, contradictions, and proof. It is easy to keep a strange story alive in the dark, where atmosphere does half the work for you. It is harder under daylight, where details have to survive being written down. Names matter there. Timelines matter. Memory becomes less poetic and more fragile. This is where the Lanulos story becomes most human. Because skepticism does not arrive as a villain. It arrives as a necessary question: what can actually be proven? To be fair to Woodrow Derenberger, the simplest skeptical explanation was never especially strong. He was not immediately dismissed as unstable or obviously fraudulent. Medical evaluations reportedly found no signs of major neurological damage, no evidence of a convulsive disorder, no obvious collapse into psychosis. Investigators did not uncover some easy scandal waiting to be exposed. He was not caught with fake photographs in the garage or wires hanging from a model spaceship. That matters. It means the case cannot be waved away with lazy certainty. There was no clean ending where everyone nodded and agreed the whole thing had been solved. Instead, there was something much more frustrating: uncertainty. And uncertainty is where folklore thrives. The strongest skeptical argument was never that Derenberger was insane. It was that the story changed. Compare the earliest roadside encounter to the later Lanulos mythology, and the difference is impossible to ignore. In the first version, the details are restrained. A strange object, a smiling man, telepathic speech, a visitor calling himself a searcher. Odd, yes, but still compact enough to feel like testimony. Then the years pass. Suddenly there is a wife named Kimmy, children, Carl Ardo, government councils, religion, 3 seasons, lifespans over a century, trade possibilities with Earth, visits to Arkansas, backyard meetings, physical trips to another world. The story does not simply continue, it expands. That pattern is familiar to anyone who studies contactee history. The first report is usually the strongest because it arrives closest to the event before public attention reshapes memory. Later versions often become larger, smoother, and more mythologically satisfying. Rough edges disappear. New details arrive exactly where listeners most want them. That does not prove deliberate deception. Memory itself is a storyteller. People reconstruct experience constantly, especially when the experience is emotionally overwhelming and repeated to strangers for years. Every retelling creates structure. Every interview asks the witness to make chaos sound coherent. Eventually, even honest memory can begin to feel like performance. And then there was Tom Monteleone. For a time, his story became one of the strongest supposed confirmations of Lanulos. Another witness, another brush with the same impossible world. For believers, it was the kind of corroboration they wanted desperately, proof that Derenberger had not built the entire thing alone. There was only one problem. Monteleone later admitted it was fiction, a story, invented. That confession matters, not because it destroys the entire case, but because it reveals how badly people wanted supporting evidence and how quickly the myth absorbed anything that looked like confirmation. Once a mystery becomes famous enough, it starts attracting stories the way old houses attract ivy. Some are true, some are decoration. Eventually they become difficult to separate. Gray Barker complicates things even further. Barker was one of the great strange figures of American UFO culture, a man who understood better than most that mystery sells. He moved through the same world as Keel, men in black stories, flying saucers, and Fortean folklore, and skeptics have long argued that he blurred the line between investigation and performance so thoroughly that even he may not have known where one ended. That matters because stories do not grow in isolation. They grow inside ecosystems. Researchers, writers, believers, late-night radio hosts, newspaper editors, local eccentrics, all feeding the same machine. Some want truth, some want wonder, some want books to sell. Usually everyone gets a little of what they came for. John C. Sherwood's work on Barker is valuable because it forces the uncomfortable possibility that at least part of the Mothman and Men in Black world was shaped not only by witnesses but by people who understood the commercial value of keeping the mystery alive. That does not erase genuine experiences, but it does remind us that folklore and entrepreneurship have always been close friends. And then there is the simplest explanation of all: social contagion. A strange event is reported. Local newspapers print it. Television repeats it. People talk. Curiosity seekers arrive. Fear spreads. Every odd light in the sky becomes connected. Every shadow at the edge of the road acquires significance. A nervous town becomes a storytelling machine. Point Pleasant and Parkersburg were perfect environments for that kind of amplification, small enough for stories to travel fast, isolated enough for mystery to feel local and personal. By the late 1960s, the region was not just experiencing strange reports, it was expecting them. Expectation changes perception. It always has. That does not mean everyone was lying. It means belief is social. We do not experience mystery alone. We experience it inside communities, inside rumor, inside the powerful human instinct to find meaning together. And still, for all the skepticism, something remains stubborn. The first report, that lonely road, that first frightened description before Lanulos became a destination and Indrid Cold became folklore. Even skeptics tend to return there because it feels different, smaller, harder, less polished, the kernel inside the myth. Maybe Derenberger saw something he could never explain. Maybe everything after that was humanity doing what humanity does best, building cathedrals around unanswered questions. That possibility may be less satisfying than proof of aliens or proof of fraud, but it is probably closer to the truth, because most enduring mysteries are built that way. This is the part of the story that matters most, not whether Indrid Cold existed, not whether Woodrow Derenberger truly stepped onto another world, not whether a dark object really blocked Interstate 77 on a rainy November night in 1966. Those are the questions that pull people in, but they are rarely the reason stories survive. The reason stories survive is need, because people do not keep retelling mysteries for 50 years simply because they are strange. They keep retelling them because the mystery is doing something for them. It explains a fear. It protects a hope. It gives shape to something life otherwise leaves unresolved. Lanulos survives because it offers something larger than evidence. It offers relief. Look at what the story promises. A world without hatred, a world without war, a world where people live longer, understand more, and somehow escaped the machinery of violence that seems to follow humanity everywhere it goes. It is not just an alien civilization. It is a correction, a version of existence where the problems we keep calling inevitable have already been solved. That is not really science fiction. That is theology wearing a space-age coat. Every era builds its paradise out of the materials it has nearby. Medieval Europe imagined shining kingdoms beyond the sea. Religious traditions imagined heaven above the clouds. Hidden Valley myths gave us Shangri-La. Lost continent stories gave us Atlantis. Cold War America had rockets, so paradise moved to the stars. Or perhaps if John Keel was right, just next door. That is why Indrid Cold is such a powerful figure. He is not terrifying because he threatens destruction. He is unsettling because he arrives as a witness to our failure. He stands there smiling, calm and almost kind, like someone looking at a civilization that has made all the wrong choices and still somehow expects sympathy. Mothman is fear. Indrid Cold is judgment, and judgment lingers longer. The smiling man does not need claws or red eyes. He asks ordinary questions in an ordinary voice, and somehow that feels worse. What are those lights? What is that city called? What kind of work do you do? Simple questions, but beneath them sits a deeper one. Why have you built your world this way? That may be why the story continues to attract people who are not even especially interested in UFOs. Lanulos is not compelling because it sounds scientifically plausible. It is compelling because it feels emotionally familiar. It sounds like the place people imagine when they are tired of the world they have. A better version, a cleaner version, a place where suffering was not accepted as normal, That desire is universal, and it makes the story strangely durable. Even the skeptics participate in it. They may reject the spaceship, reject the visitor, reject the details, but they still return to the emotional center of the case. Why did this particular myth take hold? Why this smiling man? Why this peaceful world? Why here? And why then? Because 1966 was not a calm year. America was watching war unfold on television. Trust in institutions was fraying. The future felt both exciting and dangerous. Space travel had made the impossible feel technically reachable, while nuclear anxiety made destruction feel just as close. It was an age where the sky looked like both salvation and threat. In that atmosphere, Lanulos made perfect sense. It was not just fantasy, it was a response, a story built to answer a moment. And perhaps that is true of all folklore worth remembering. It tells us less about what happened and more about what people were trying to survive. This is why the Silver Bridge collapse became tied to Mothman, even though the official cause was engineering failure and not prophecy. People do not want catastrophe to be random. They want warning. They want signs. They want the world to be legible, even when it is cruel. The same instinct lives inside Lanulos. People do not want suffering to be permanent. They want proof that somewhere, somehow, someone figured it out. And maybe that is the real reason the story never quite dies. Because every generation rediscovers the same quiet suspicion that the world we built cannot be the best we can do. Somewhere, the story whispers, there is another way. Maybe it is a hidden valley. Maybe it is another planet. Maybe it is just the version of ourselves we have not managed to become yet. Lanulos may not exist as geography, but as mythology, it is very real. It exists in the same place all perfect worlds exist, somewhere between memory and longing. And perhaps that is why the final image of Indrid Cold remains so strangely powerful. Not a monster chasing people through the woods, not a great machine descending from the sky, just a man standing quietly on the side of the road, smiling like he knows something we do not. Smiling like he has already seen the place we spend our whole lives trying to imagine. And perhaps he has. Or perhaps the smile only reflects our own desire looking back at us. Either way, the highway is still there. Interstate 77 still cuts through those same hills. The rain still falls. The bridges still glow at night above the river. People still drive home alone with the radio low and the road stretching farther than expected. And somewhere in the dark, every driver carries the same private thought. What if the world is stranger than it looks? That question is older than flying saucers, older than folklore, older than roads. And it is probably the reason we are all here, listening together now, not because we expect answers, but because some mysteries feel better when shared. And so the story remains, not solved, not settled, just waiting, the way certain stories always seem to wait, somewhere between history and folklore, between witness testimony and the quiet machinery of myth. The road where Woodrow Derenberger stopped his truck still exists. Interstate 77 still runs through those West Virginia hills, cutting through darkness the same way it did in November of 1966. People still drive that stretch at night. The rain still gathers on the windshield. The hills still rise black against the sky. Parkersburg still glows in the distance like a handful of lights trying to hold back a much larger dark. Most of them are probably thinking about groceries, work tomorrow, bills, whether they remembered to lock the back door. That is how these stories always begin, not with people searching for mystery, but with ordinary people trying to get home. That may be the reason this one endures, because at its center, beneath all the names and mythology and impossible geography, it is still the story of one man on one road having one moment that refused to fit inside the life he had built. Everything after that, Lanulos, Indrid Cold, the visitors, the books, the theories, may be expansion, interpretation, folklore gathering around a single hard center. Or maybe not. Maybe he really did meet someone standing at the edge of our understanding. Maybe there are places we do not know how to describe, civilizations that look at us the way we look at our own unfinished past, and maybe somewhere beyond the noise of our ordinary lives there is, in fact, a place where people learned how to stop hurting each other. I suspect that possibility is why the story still matters, not because it proves anything, because it comforts something. It suggests that our failures are not permanent, that history is not the only way a civilization can turn out, that somewhere, whether in the stars or only in the imagination, another version of life is possible. That is a powerful thing to offer people, especially at night, especially in uncertain times, especially when the world feels loud and unfinished. Maybe Lanulos is not a place. Maybe it is a question. What would a better world actually require of us? And are we willing to become the kind of people who could live there? Those are not UFO questions. Those are human ones. And perhaps that is why Indrid Cold still stands there in memory, not as a monster, not even really as an alien, but as a mirror. Calm, smiling, patient, asking ordinary questions that somehow feel larger than they should. What are those lights? What is that city called? What kind of work do you do? Simple things. Until you realize he may have been asking something else entirely. Who are you? What have you built? And why? That is where we leave it tonight. Somewhere on a wet Appalachian highway beneath bridge lights and river fog, with the radio low and the road still stretching ahead into darkness. Maybe there was never a world called Lanulos. Maybe there was. Either way, the mystery continues, because the best mysteries do not end when the story is over. They follow you home. From the quiet shores of the people of the water, where the mountains keep watch and the rivers remember everything, this has been the High Strangeness Sleep Society.